Come on. Okay. So our job today is to kind of give a definition of what evil is, and then the heck, and then to kind of talk about the continuum of evil, and then give definition of probably one of the ultimate types of evil, which is the taking of someone else's life. Okay, so that's kind of where we're headed. And let's see where we get. So, the working definition of evil that we'll use for our class is the exercise of power. Okay, power being in that you, as the potential uh, evildoer, has some type of ability to control or to take over someone else's will or who they are. And this is important to intentionally harm someone in three ways: psychologically, hurt someone, physically, harm someone psychologically. So this can take the form of, for example, bullying someone else, or calling someone else names in order to get them to feel like they're worthless or they're not good. Cyberbullying is probably a good example of harming someone psychologically. Hurting someone physically, this is probably the most clear one and the one that our legal system uses. And this is the physical harm to someone else, whether it go from hitting and slapping clear to killing the individual, or passing the person along. The other one that is a little bit vague, but is important, is destroying someone morally. Okay. Um, and probably a good example of destroying someone morally, kind of on a broader social level, is things like anti-Semitism, okay, where people purposely um, um, make someone's moral position, for example, based on religion and being Jewish, as something wrong, evil, destructive, and the like. So that kind of is more on the global level. We can think of things like terrorism. One of their main goals is to destroy another people's moral sense of who they are. Okay. On an individual level, it's really closely related to psychological harm, but it's really destroying someone's sense of who they are. Okay. Saying that, for example, because you're Christian, um, um, you think everybody else is evil. Okay, that's an example of morally destroying someone's belief system. We can think of things like prejudice and discrimination. All of those are aimed at morally destroying the opposition. Dehumanization is another good example. So for example, um, naming someone in a dehumanizing way. So, for example, one easy way to think of our current um, deportation thing is the people who are pro deportation call them illegals. They refuse to call them human beings. They refuse to call them people, mothers, fathers. So they demoralize them to their illegals, and that's all they are. They don't have a humanness to them. And that's one way to kind of be able to then go about systematically actually going and physically harming and removing people from their homes and their place of being. Okay, that's just an example of morally destroying another individual. We can also think of how we define criminals, right? That person is an inmate or that person is a criminal. We don't normally sit there and say, well, but they're also a father or a mother. They're they're a community member. We often don't use those terms because we want to get that distance away from them and morally make them so that they're less than the people who are judging them. Okay, so these are all ways that we do this. And we can also do these on subtle levels if we think of things like sexism and the way men and women talk about each other in more demoralizing or dehumanizing way. Okay. And so all of these are forms or exercises of power of one group towards another or one individual towards another individual. Okay. So here's kind of a example of a continuum of evil, and we're gonna mostly focus today on the issue of homicide. Okay, but we think about on this level passively accepting evil that's going on. So this would be, for example, when we look at Nazi Germany and Germans who just passively allowed what happened to uh, during the Holocaust. Okay, this would be the person who is a witness to things like domestic violence and sexual assault, and passively just let that occur and not integrate into action. Okay, all of those are an passive acceptance and justification for those things to happen. Okay. And then now the thing that I want to make clear though is these are not based on what is least harmful to most harmful. Okay. Because if we look at things like, for example, psychological abuse and physical abuse, and we talk to, for example, people who have gone through domestic violence and those kinds of things, many will say they preferred to be hit than what they were told. Okay. The reason why this is kind of the continuum is this trajectory that you see ultimately often leads to the ultimate type of evil, which is the taking of someone's life. So usually we start with passive acceptance, and then we'll go down kind of the domestic violence route. Then normally, or usually, I shouldn't say normally, usually it gets into psychological abuse, telling the person that they're worthless or they wouldn't have anything without them, that no one else is going to love them, that their family, that not going to be around their family. And then harassment. Where were you all day today? What were you doing at noon? You're not going to go see your parents. They're not that. And then into physical abuse. Oh, you want to disobey me? And then taking advantage. This starts into the economic abuse, the taking advantage of the thing that that person brings to the relationship and not appreciating it. And then, yes, can also lead to things like sexual deviance. I worked with a domestic violence victim who ended up passing away from her injuries, where the abuser had a contract that that person would have sex with whoever that person wanted them to, and she would have to submit to that. Okay. And then the ultimate end is homicide. Okay. And we see this as a common trajectory for many forms of abuse. So those are some kind of things to kind of think about this continuum. Okay. Now we're going to kind of skip quite a bit of this because I want to get into our topic. If we have time, we'll come back to this. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about a homicide and the reasons why people commit homicides. Okay. because it's kind of an interesting topic. All right. So some of the reasons that have often been thrown out is a person feels a threat towards themselves, so that it was a protective mechanism to protect their way of life, for example, or a self-defense mechanism. Very commonly among relationship violence and domestic violence, it's a claim of passion, that the person was so enraged with passion that they assaulted the individual and took their life. Psychopathology we'll get to. That's definitely a reason, but it only makes up about 1 to 2% of homicides in at least the United States and Great Britain. Mental illness, and they have a gun. And these are the main kind of arguments right now of why someone would commit a homicide. And what we'll learn, I hope here, and we'll learn when we get to abnormal psychology, is mental illness is not a really good answer of why someone commits homicide. And the reason being is if we look at the common mental illnesses that people would say would drive someone towards homicide, it's usually something like depression, which, sorry to say this, a person with actual depression does not have the motivation or the will to go about committing a homicide. Anxiety disorders is a common one. While those individuals have the inability to plan, they're too anxious about the consequences and that it would lead to more anxiety. If we look at post-traumatic stress disorder, those people want to escape that trauma. They don't want to cause more. Okay. If we look at some of the other disorders and whatnot, we find that you're actually safer, for example, living in a home with schizophrenics than you are living by your current neighbor. And so that doesn't always work out. They have a gun. Okay. And we will see that the likelihood of completion of a homicide is among gun owners. Okay. And so the increased risk of a homicide does increase with gun ownership. Um, Now, that doesn't, if we look at attempts of homicide, then that's a different story between attempt versus completed homicide. The more lethal the weapon available to the person committing homicide, the more likely it will end up in a completed homicide. Okay. So it's more of a risk factor than it might be a causal factor, but we can look at some evidence in that way. Now, interestingly, probably something that might be of interest to us here, we actually live in the safest time in history. And I know that sounds strange because of all the mass shootings um, that we see, the school shootings, the rioting behavior, quote unquote, and media constantly bombarding us with all these negative stories about homicide and people who are hurting each other. But in reality, statistically, we live in the safest time period in human history. Okay. Now, why does it seem like it's a dangerous world? It's because we have more access to our world. We have more access to what's going on in our state, in our nation, in our world. But statistically, you're more safe living here today than any other time in history. Okay. However, there are two types of homicides that have been on the increase, and another one that we'll need to talk about. The first one that has been on the increase for about the last 3 decades is infant homicide. So while we see a decrease in adult homicide, we have seen a steady increase in infant homicide. And what are some of the explanations for this? Why is it that people seem to be harming infants more than adults? Okay. One theory is what's called the frustration theory. Okay. This is where we live in such a more quote unquote complicated world. Um, in a world where there's more pressure. If you think about, again, what the news is saying about increased costs, the inaccessibility of home ownerships, low wage jobs, all of these lead to frustration and therefore lead to homicide of an infant. Okay. This theory is grounded in biology. Okay. And I want to make this very clear is if we look across species and you have a brood, okay, if there's not enough resources for let's say if we have like a let's say a mother wolf that has let's say four pups, okay, if there's not enough resources for all three pups to sur four pups to survive, they will then kill off whatever number of pups it would be necessary for the ones who can survive to survive. Okay. And this is what frustration theory is based upon, is this idea that I can't take care of this in order to survive. Okay. And so that's kind of what frustration theory is built on. Unwanted burden theory is this idea that sometimes people have infants and they don't realize that they require 24/7 care, especially human infants, especially for the first 2 years. And so maybe they have an infant and it's maybe a love child, or they had an infant thinking that it would bring something into their life and make their life more meaningful, or they do it for other reasons. Um, um, and it doesn't work out the way they expected it to in their head, okay, and leads them to this unwanted burden, okay. And then there's the neglected care theory, where simply kind of like the frustration theory, that the parent or the caregiver just does not have the resources to care for the child and sees no way out. And this is kind of the difference between frustration theory and neglect theory. In neglect theory, it's that they just don't, that they probably have access to resources. They probably maybe live with a good, but they can't see those resources. Okay. So um, so that is that. So again, when we look at the comparisons between homicides, so this is greater than and then we have infant homicides. We see that other than in Ukraine, infant homicides have far exceeded um, adult. We can even include this in Austria, excuse me, but I don't have Arizona numbers in here. I think Arizona is close to, I think it's either Idaho and Minnesota. But we do see, if we look at the suicide rates, we do need to make a note that suicides are much more common than homicide. And that's an important point that we need to make, because that's the taking of one's own life instead of taking of someone else's life. Okay. And so here's kind of another example. So as we see, this is males here in the United States, and we could see adults, and this is 74 to 99 to 95 to 99. And I looked up the current rates, and we're right. If I would have updated these, we're kind of right here with adults, right around this 100 mark. So we've had a steady decrease. But when we look at babies and infants, so infants are basically newborns. Babies are about 6 months to 2 years of age. Right now, we're about right here. So we can see that this is on a steady increase. Same with infants and same with children. Okay. So currently, who's at most risk? Yes, number wise, we can see that adults still have a high number. Excuse me, had a cup fall. Of course, adults number wise have more, but we can see that when we look at the increase, it's uh, similar. And as we can see with females, it's even more stark. Okay, if we look back here with men, we're starting up here in the 140s, 160s. With infants and babies, we're in the hundreds and 60s. And then when we look at infant uh, females, we can see that again, it's on the decrease for adults, but a huge stark increase. In fact, more female in babies are murdered each year or between these years and currently than are adult females. Okay. So this is kind of a marked example of what we're talking about. Okay. Now, what are some of the predictors? So when we talk about predictors of homicide, especially infant homicide, what are some of the predictors of homicide? Well, one is suicide rates for infants, and it's represented by this green line right here. This is what we call a slope or a regression line. That as we see as the number of suicides increases, the number of infant homicides increases. So suicide rate, and as we all know that recently, suicide rates have been on the increase for about the last 20 years. In fact, a stark increase compared to these numbers from 87 to 2001. And this can account for then the continued increase when it comes to infant homicides. So So that's infant homicides. That's something to kind of consider. There was one other graph that I thought was interesting, but I can't find it. I think we'll get to it here in a minute. All right. Now let's talk now, getting off of that topic. Let's talk about what are known as nine non-psychopathic adult homicides. Okay. Is believe it or not, psychopaths don't make up the majority of murders here in the United States. In fact, um, greater than 50% are intimate partner homicide or what's called family side, meaning that it's within the family. So a brother, sister, or a uncle, cousin, there's some relationship of some type. Okay. So the majority of homicide is within the family system or the intimate partner system. Then about around 30% is intergroup conflict homicide. This one, I should note, includes school shootings and mass homicides. And so that's within this category. Now, with mass shootings, we do need to differentiate between two types of mass shootings. The majority of mass shootings are intimate partner related in the United States. Okay. So those kind of are absorbed up here in this interpartner homicide. Then we have things like school shootings and the random shootings we see in the community. That's within this intergroup conflict homicide. Okay. And then about less than 9% is psychopaths. I should mention this intergroup conflict. The intergroup I should mention, this does include, for example, drug-related crimes, homicides. This includes um, 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 state-sanctioned types of homicide. It and so it also has includes things like hate crimes. Okay. Um, we should note that The United States has the highest homicide rate of any of the 26 modern countries. We average some usually between about 5 to 6 per 100,000. In the other 26 modern countries, it's about 1.7 in 100,000. And we should note that this kind of goes along with it. The United States has the highest incarceration rate of these 26 modern countries. And in fact, if we want to get a country that has the same number of incarcerated people, we would need to look at North Korea. Um, and if we look at this from a sociological perspective, current research is starting to show that rates of homicide on our national level seems to be mostly highly associated with militarized police forces and individualistic culture. So when we look at areas in the country that have high homicide rates, those homicide rates increased as the police force became more and more military-like. And when we talk about militarization police, we that's counter to what's called public policing. Okay. In militarization, it's an authoritarian system where that is highly weaponized. Community policing is when police officers go to the community, talk with them, create partnerships, develop relationships with community members to help reduce and solve criminal behavior. Okay. We also see this in areas of the country that are highly individualistic, meaning they believe that in that they are and you are the reason for their success, and everything else. That individualism is this idea that the individual is responsible for their own actions, independent of anywhere else. That's different from what we call collective communities or collective cultures. Collective cultures are where individuals, my success is your success is my success. And that's kind of the difference between individualistic versus collective type of cultures. Okay. That one's this kind of goes back to this graph right here kind of goes back to um, um, uh, I want to I want to clarify here. This is kind of the opposite of what we saw with infanticide. If you remember in the graph with infanticide, there was a relationship between infanticide and suicide. It's the opposite relationship when we get to adults. When we see, for example, this line right here, this is homicide rates, the one with the circle, I believe. No, this is suicide rates. So this line represents suicide rates. This line represents homicide rates. And what we generally see is when suicide rates are low, homicide rates are high. And just the opposite, except for on this other end right here, okay, is generally when suicide rates are high, homicide rates are low. Okay. And we see the same trend with women, where we see this line where with suicide, when they're high, they tend to have low homicide rates, and just the opposite on the other end. So that's kind of, again, bringing about the relationship about ending one's own life versus ending another's life. Okay. This graph, just kind of getting into it more, these numbers right here are what we call correlates. Correlates is how much is for example, homicide, the number of homicides committed related to other types of crimes. Okay. So when we look at these, we find that there are basically 5 things that are related to homicide rates within a community. One, the more inequality within the community, the higher the rate. The more infant mortality there is, the higher the rate. Um, Poverty, higher the rate. Okay. These two, the more economic growth and the more developed a community is, actually is associated with decreases rates of homicide. So the more developed and economically healthy tend to be associated with decreased rates in homicide, where inequality, infant mortality, and poverty index tend to be associated with higher rates. Okay. So we can kind of see these kind of things working out. This one is an interesting, especially in our given time where our current administration says we're going to get rid of all the immigrants, or at least the illegal immigrants, and that's going to decrease our violence here in the United States. Well, this study has been shown over and over and over that when the United States, and this is both legal and illegal immigration, that when we get to a negative immigration rate, by the arrows going this way, our homicide rates go up. So the less people we bring into the United States, the higher our homicide rates. Okay. The more and more people we bring into the country, our homicide rates go down. So this is kind of the science behind immigration, and why there are a large number of people who reject our current administration's notion that if we get rid of people in this country, our homicide and our violence rates will go down. No, actually, statistically, historically, when we have a negative immigration rate, meaning we have more people leaving than coming, our homicide rates go up. And then as we start to bring more people here, our homicide rates go down. So this is why there is a large number of individuals who reject the current, at least from a scientific perspective. I'm saying scientists in this area are kind of rejecting this notion that we get rid of these people and all of a sudden we're going to be a utopia, nonviolent place, when statistically it's been shown that it will actually increase our mean homicide rates over time. So just so you know why if you talk to social scientists and scientists, they kind of largely reject this notion of our current direction here in the United States. Um, and again, income inequality. If we look at, for example, adolescents births among 21 of the richest developed countries in the United Nations. So this is the reason why this is important, okay, is 1,000 women aged 15 to 19 who had a child between the age of 15 to 19. So the number of children born to women between the age of 15 to 19. And this is the inequality marker. So how income equality between these individuals and everyone else. And you can see that again, among the 21 richest developed countries, here we are in the United States. Not only do we have the highest birth rate, but we have the highest inequality rate for children being born to these moms. Okay. Why is this important? Because the number of homicides increases when a child is born to a woman between the age of 15 to 19. And we're going to see a few things with this. If we were to look at this in Social 101, for example, we would see one of the highest risk factors for child abuse, and we'll actually talk about this in developmental psychology, is on the mother's end, one of the highest risk for child abuse is the mother's age. Okay. Children who are born to a mom between the age of, it's a slightly higher than this one, between the age of 17 to 23 have the highest risk of physical abuse, neglect, and sexual abuse. Okay. And we see this play out in homicide rates. Here's Arizona right here. Okay. The more women this age, the higher the homicide rate. Now, I want to just kind of emphasize this. Is this mom's fault? The answer is no. Okay. And so I don't want any of the anyone going and saying, "Oh, you had your baby when you were young, and so it's your fault that your child was da 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 da." That's the wrong message to send. What we find is that it comes down to, back to this other slide that we just talked about. Inequality rates. Okay, the inability to access resources, the inability to provide a safe home for a child. Okay, and so, but as we can see, as if we decrease inequality rates, whoops, we increase development and economic growth, that reduces these things. Okay, so that's something to think about on a sociological level, right? Um, so let's talk about uh, uh, let's talk about. I mentioned that greater than 50% of homicides are intimate partner or family. Okay. And so this is kind of an example of that. So this is that 50%. And if we look at 2008, this number right here is actually 2020. I probably should update this one again. This is a 2020 number. If you notice um, something kind of interesting, and this is kind of something, this is a thought project for you, okay, is I mentioned that all these homicides are on the decrease. So if we look at the general trends, these are all going lower. Family disputes are not going as quickly, but we go from 427 wordy quarrels and we're down to 325. We start 356 with personal enemies. This is wanting to get back at your spouse. This one's been kind of on the increase. Okay. But the general trend is these have been decreasing slightly over time. One that has seen the most significant increase since 2008 is love affairs, basically cheating on a partner. Okay. Um, and this is kind of an interesting thing to think about. Back in 2008, there were 155. This 2020 number, I believe it was like 420. It was equal to personal, this one here. It was up here with this one. Okay. And the thing that I would urge you to think about, so why is it that over this past, several years, we have seen an increase in homicides due to love affairs? Well, there's something that was interesting that happened in the United States and around the world around 2008 and 2007. I think it started in like 2006, but it really started in 2007, 2008. And that's something called Facebook. It's something called the personal cell phone. It's something called instant messaging. It's something called different ways to call your love affair, to communicate. But all of these also have open access. Okay. So I want you to think about this. Since the advent of social media, instant messaging, we have almost quadrupled the number of homicides due to affairs. Now, this is the interesting thing behind this is there has not been an increase in in the number of individuals who have been committing affairs. That number has stayed very, very consistent population-wise. And so while the number of people having affairs has not decreased, the number of people who have have been victims of homicide due to having an affair has increased. And currently, sociologists and some psychologists and whatnot are really thinking this is a product of social media, instant messaging, and all of those other ways that you can openly communicate. And obviously, of course, get quote unquote caught in that behavior. So something kind of interesting to think about murders and motives when it comes to family and intimate partner homicides, which again, I emphasize this is greater than 50% of homicides in the United States. Okay. All right. I want to talk a little bit about intimate partner homicides because it is while infant homicides are in the increase, these are on the decrease. These tend to still have the highest number. The highest number of homicides in the United States is in intimate partner homicides. And it is true that men engage in behaviors much more than women. But this is an interesting trend that we'll need to look for. Ever since about 2017, we've seen a large increase in female domestic intimate partner homicide. So while it has traditionally and still is really high percentage of men committing these behaviors, we are seeing an uptick since about 2017 or so in the number of females that are committing this type of homicide. Um, we should note that LGBTQ communities are not immune to this type of evil. Um, that the percentages of gay men and lesbian men and women who engage in these behaviors are not much different. And so this is something to kind of think about when we look at it from an LGBTQ perspective. However, one thing that we should note is that intimate partner homicides in LGBT uh, partnerships have only really been measured the same way that male-female intimate partner homicides have been measured for about the last were 12 years. So there's probably still a lot of things to be worked out in trying to figure out LGBTQ numbers, but right now the risk really isn't decreased by being in a same gender relationship currently. Intimate partner homicides, about 83% occur in the home. 44% of females, 62% of male offenders tend to be intoxicated. Now, this is a scary number, okay? And I want you to think about this. Um, this means that 56% of women who commit intimate partner homicide and 48%, am I thinking that? 38% of men have no taxation whatsoever. They do it perfectly sober. And so when we look at this, do intimate partner homicides occur because of drugs and alcohol and those kinds of things? While they can contribute it to it, they don't answer that they're the primary reason for a homicide to have occurred in the first place, if given such a high percentage of males and females commit these crimes perfectly sober. Okay. The other kind of thing that we need to look at, well, women kill because they're victim or because of victimization. Well, the statistics again in this area don't quite work out either because about 28% of women killed their intimate partner because of victimization of domestic violence. Okay, that means 72% committed for other reasons. And I think if we go back to that other graph we earlier talked about, around cheating and wordy conversations, we kind of figure that one out. But again, the whole idea of victimization leads a female to homicide doesn't work out about 28%. Now, one that does work out is the myth that men kill out of jealousy or loss of control in the relationship. This is generally true. About 86% of men killed for this very reason because and this is the scary part about men in this situation. When we talk about jealousy, it can just purely be the idea that my partner could have someone else. It's not that they do. It's not that their partner flirts. It's not that their partner is doing anything, but just the pure thought that their partner could have a relationship with someone else can then ignite this snowball effect to where then it goes to what's called a loss of control. So they feel this loss and they feel like they can't control the relationship anymore. And again, this is about 86% of men lead to this reason. All right. And one of the things, 28% of women who killed their partner was a victim. We do see a greater number of 68% of men had a history of interpartner violence, them as the offender. Okay. And so women being killed because of domestic violence, when we look at it from the male perspective, and the male's behavior, about 68% had a history. Now, this is the difficult part about the 68% of of men had a history of intimate partner violence. It may not have been with their victim, okay? And this is a hard statistic to kind of unwind. This could be a man who had a history of intimate partner with his ex-wife, his ex-girlfriend, his even going clear, it could have been 20, 30 years ago. And there's has had been no violence in his current relationship with his current victim. So this statistic is really hard to really kind of wrap our heads around because, yes, the notion of history doesn't necessarily mean the victim and them were in a intimate partner violence relationship. Okay, it's just having that history of it can be one of the reasons, that loss of control. And we do know that men who have a history of intimate partner violence have a history of feeling losing control in their relationship. And so they could have a perfectly okay relationship, but if they start to feel like they can't control it or they don't have a sense of place or a sense of control over it, this can lead to, again, an intimate partner homicide. Okay. Um, let's Okay, so this one, we'll see some graphs on this. Um, this is if you look at this first column, this is the spouse as a victim. So this is husband, this is wife, and these are the type of weapons. Okay, so I wonder. I think this other graph is easier to read. No. Okay, this one is easier to read. So we'll come back to this one in just a minute. I actually want to start with this one. So, husbands as a victim, what is their age risk, right? So, if you're a husband, you're mostly at risk at the age of about 20 to about it starts to reduce in 50, but we'll draw the line right here. So this is when, if we really look at it, the majority of men are are at risk based on age. So 20 to about 55, 60. If we look at women, on the other hand, uh, again, wife as victim, we start at about 18 and we go a little bit further. We'll cross it right at about 70. Okay. So this is the age range of risk. So for men, it's about 20 to 55. For women, it's about 18 to about 60, 70. But you know, the thing that interests me on this graph is I want to know about this guy, this woman who was 95 and she killed what is that, 62, 63-year-old husband. And on this one over here, I want to know this kind of this 85-year-old guy who killed his 30-year-old wife. Those outliers seem a lot more interesting to me than the grouping. But all joking aside, I do wonder about these. They'd be interesting case studies. But even when we look at this husband over here, yeah. Anyways, notwithstanding outliers, um, we do see that so what about a wife and offending? So wife and offending, we're looking at someone around 20 to about the age of 60. Men who offend, we're looking at about 18. Actually, I got this backwards. We really need to look at it this way. For women, 15 years old. Okay, it's because this is the female victim to about 70-year-old. So we got to look at it this way. Sorry, I got these backwards. So for a female, they're at most risk between 15 and 70. Men, it's about the right age, about 60, about 20 to about the age of 60. And then for the offender, for a wife, we're looking at about 20 to 55, about the same age as the victim. But men tend to be that 20 to about 60, 70. Okay. So a lot wider range for both the female victim and a male offender, a smaller range if the husband is the victim and the wife is the offender. Okay. All right. Still want to know about those outliers. All right. So what about use of weapon? Okay. And if you look at these lines, the solid lines are the weapon the husband uses. The dotted lines are the weapon that women use. Okay. And these are what's called residuals, meaning the most likely. Uh, so you'll notice that this kind of goes, if this line right here goes to this end, this other side, it means that a female uh, dotted line. A female victim, a husband, is less likely to use a handgun after the age of about 60. Okay. But you can see women are at most risk of being victims of a handgun between about the age of, again, 15 to about the age of 40. Okay. Men are at most risk when the spouse is between about the age of 30, peaking at about the age of 50. Okay, so you can kind of see how these kind of work. Long guns, um, men are more likely to use. A knife. This is one that is kind of interesting. So women are more likely to use a knife between the age of 20 to 40. Men are more likely to use a knife after the age of about 40 up to about the age of 80. Okay. And then we could see things like strangulation at a younger age, no weapon at all tends to be at a younger age versus an older age. So these are the different kind of risk factors that, again, that would be considered based upon age. Okay. So, sad truth, and this is something that we should consider, is that the scary part of this first analysis is on homicide with focus on the United States, that individuals, when it comes to a homicide, are more unsafe in their own home than you are walking down the street among strangers. And that statistic goes across communities. A person is 90% more likely to be killed by a family member or an intimate partner than you are by a stranger. So statistically, you have a 9 in 10 chance of of one of your family members or your intimate partner kill you, and you only have a 1 in 10 chance of being murdered by a stranger. And this is kind of an interesting thing, and it goes back to that immigration thing. Is that uh, if you were other than the United States and Great Britain, this statistic is backwards in other countries. In other countries, you're more likely to be murdered by a stranger from another country than you would be by your family member or your neighbor. But in the Great Britain and the United States, you're more likely to be murdered by your own family member or your own intimate partner. And I really want you to think about that as far as risk and what we do with our communities. Um, and so those are some things to think about when it comes to homicides here in the United States. And this plays out to that graph I showed on immigration, that we are more dangerous when we're left to our own than when we are actually bringing more people in. Just something to kind of think about when we look at actual homicide rates here in the United States. Okay, this is going to leave us to, now that we got through that, this is going to leave us to our conversation this coming Tuesday. One thing that I didn't bring up is I didn't bring up school shootings and mass shootings very much. I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, before we get into psychopaths and serial killers, that what types of homicides are on the increase. And it is true that school shootings and mass stranger shootings have been on the steady increase. Um, I think it was between 1990 and the 2000s, it increased something like 400%. And we will get into that a little bit more in this section that we're going to go through, but also when we get to the abnormal psychology section. So I don't want you to think that I'm ignoring that type of hurt and harm that is caused in communities. I'm just simply putting it on hold because there's other areas where it needs to be talked about in more detailed expression. But this is where we are going to go this coming Tuesday to kind of wrap up our conversation on for Halloween and scary things in the world is we're going to talk about psychopathology and serial killing. And we'll see that there are people, if we can really say that, is there a person that can be born evil, meaning they lack conscientiousness or care about other people? Yes, there is a percentage of human beings that are born or develop that through developmental processes. And that's where we'll be heading. But for now, I'm going to stop my sharing. I'm going to